Thanks everyone. It is 2:03 and I think it's time to get cracking. Welcome to today's webinar, Flicking the Switch. Where are we on electric trucks? Maybe we'll have a tad bit of hydrogen as well. My name is Lauren Hewitt. I'm the CEO of Queensland Transport and Logistics Council. We're an independent industry advisory body here in Queensland, and we're really proud today to have partners along movement. Together we have created Australia's first independent platform designed to address the barriers in heavy truck transport sectors going to zero emissions. We are not selling trucks. We're not taking money to sell you a transition that you don't want. What we do want is for people to be as informed as possible. We want investment to be logical. We want the transition to be smooth, and we want to reduce and minimise the chance for failures. We want to understand and address any barriers to adoption, and we want to bring along interested parties together to share information about real-world success and also failures so that we can all leverage off those early adopters out there. Our program, the Future Freight Energy Hub, yes, sounds a little like something out of Utopia, and you can blame Mark Gjerek for that, was conceived back in 2022 after we had some really good discussions, but concerning ones at major transport hubs in Queensland. We were talking with ports, heavy vehicle fleets, large precincts, and after hearing all of their concerns and importantly the many barriers that were going to stop them in going to zero emissions, we wanted to give them back what they needed to hear. We wanted to give it back to them in a forum that they understand and will learn from, and that's seeing and hearing other people's successes and failures, seeing application in real world things rather than spin. So the Future Freight Energy Hub program comprises of a few things. One is a webinar program, and today we're here today in second of series of that webinar. There's a newsletter also. I'll pop the link up if you're not subscribed to the newsletter. There's some fantastic articles. Probably sometimes they're a bit on non-PC, so you won't see them written by a government department, but they really call it as it is from our perspective. And there's also funding that we provide for 3 hubs every year to get independent information from movement on what their journey towards net zero is. So far we've had the Port of Brisbane, the Brisbane Airport avail themselves of that funding. This year we're really excited to have 3 new precincts apply for funding in bespoke areas, and they're bringing along a whole cohort of people to touch, feel and learn about what the future is, what's actually happening and how they get themselves ready for it. Before we kick off today, some housekeeping. We're going to hear from 4 really amazing leaders in the zero emissions freight transport space. After their presentations, we're going to allow 5 minutes of short Q&A. So if you've got any questions, please pop them in the chat as we go. That's how we're going to work out what your questions are. And we're going to run things on a pretty tight schedule so that we get you out by 3:30 Brisbane time. As we'll learn today, the transition to zero emissions isn't easy. It's not as simple as purchasing a new shiny truck or a charger or just asking government to hand us some money. To set the context on what achieving net zero is going to be like in Australia in the place of a growing freight task, we've got our first speaker today, Mark Gjerek, the founder of Sustainable Transport Consultancy Movement. And out of interest, Mark drives a Tesla. He owns it and loves it. And his dream vehicle is not yet available in Australia. He wants a Ranger, an electric one. He wants to go off-road with it, and he wants something affordable. So we'll hear a bit more about people's fantasy cars later in the presentation, but thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Lauren. I think I'm just going to share my screen. Stop me if you can't see that screen. So I'm Mark Gjerek, Managing Director at Movement. We're a team of consultants. Our mission is to decarbonise transport, pretty simple, and we focus on vehicles and energy. And we've been working with Lauren and QTLC for a couple of years now on a few projects, but really excited to be part of this Future Freight Energy Hubs program because we think it's a real gap in the market. So without further ado, I'm going to dive straight in, and we're time limited, so I'm just going to rip that band-aid off straight away. And I know this is a presentation about battery or a session about battery electric trucks, but I'm just going to say we know that they're really exciting and they're going to be an essential part of the transition to net zero, but they're also not some magic pudding that's going to suddenly fix all of the emissions issues that we've got in the freight sector. And I'll work my way through that. We know that they're essential because if we look overseas at more advanced markets, we can see that here's a graph based on the ICCT graph, looking at overseas markets, the US, the EU, and California, and we know that those markets see battery electric trucks or zero emission trucks as the critical pathway to decarbonisation. So this is a graph of sales share up this column here on the right hand side, sales share of zero emission trucks, and you can see that by 2030 the US and the EU are somewhere between, let's say, 30 and 40% uptake, and by 2035 California is expecting every truck sold to be a zero emission truck. So very impressive uptake rates, right? And it's important to point out here, I think, that they're very different markets to Australia from an energy and emissions perspective, right? They've had decades of progressive policies around incentives, regulations, CO2 standards, a whole range of different measures, and they also had to drive different trucks in different conditions. So we can't possibly hope to do that starting where we are now in the same time frame, but it's a pretty good beacon to aim for. I would point out, though, that those very impressive numbers around sales share are share of new vehicle sales, not emissions, right? And we need to not decouple those things, but recognise the difference. Let's not conflate those two things. So we're going to need more than just zero emission trucks, and I'll show you why here. We did this modelling last year, looking at what the uptake of zero emission trucks might look like in terms of the impact on truck emissions. And three scenarios here. The black one is, let's call it BAU, so starting, keep selling the same trucks we do today, mostly diesel. If we started and baseline that against 2022, within 10 years, or 8 years, sorry, our emissions from trucks would go up by about 20%. This is this black line, based purely or mostly on the fact that the freight task is growing. We then modelled what, let's call it a market-led uptake of zero emission trucks might look like. And actually the impact on emissions would be relatively small because the slow turnover of the fleet, we've got an aging truck fleet, you're relying on uptake of a small percentage of new vehicle sales, which are themselves a percentage of the total fleet, right? So we'd still end up with like a 13, 14% increase in emissions with a market-led uptake. So the impact is relatively minor. So we're going to need to do more than that. Doing a bit of a thought experiment of like, well, so what would it take to reach the Paris target commitment that we've got? I know that not every sector has to reach that target, but just as a bit of a thought experiment, to get to 43% reduction by 2030, we would have had to have mandated every new truck sale from last year, oops, too late, to be a zero emission truck to get to that level. As I said, that's a bit of a thought experiment. But if you pause on that for a second, that's a very ambitious goal. And if we go back to what we were talking about here, that level of commitment, even in California, doesn't happen until 2035, right? So impractical, impossible, not enough supply, but it just gives you a sense of that scale. The other thing to point out is that this is a two-step process, and this often gets lost. The truck is just one part of that transition. The other part is actually the energy, and that's the bit that is really, really important. I'm probably going to upset some people here, but it's a harsh reality, unfortunately, that just transitioning to an electric truck using a dirty grid, I'm not suggesting Australia is a dirty grid, but that can actually increase emissions, which is not the case for light vehicles, which people are used to seeing, right? But it certainly can be the case when you look at it on a life cycle basis. So there's been a few studies recently. Here's one from Volvo. I'm not going to single them out. We know Scania has done similar. The ICCT has done similar. And there was a paper that released this year for a similar analysis in Australia. But if you take the life cycle emissions, I'll walk you through this graph, don't panic. There are emissions involved in making the truck. So, here's total emissions produced and kilometres along this axis here. Making the truck produces some emissions, right? Now, this yellow line is a diesel truck. Every time you use that truck to drive, you're increasing the emissions created in its life cycle. If you were to take a battery electric truck, which produces more emissions to be made, and power it with a coal-fired electricity grid, purely coal, which again, we're better than that. You never get to this kind of break-even point where the emissions become lower than a diesel truck. That's not good news. But the good news is if you do power it with renewable energy, which is this horizontal grey line, is you get that payback or that break-even point within 100,000 kilometres, right? And as I said, this isn't a Volvo presentation. There are many other studies that pretty much say a similar thing, depending on what assumptions you use, including this one from that was done for Australia. The simple lesson here is if you're going to go to an electric truck, then you've got to pair that with renewable energy, because you don't want to be achieving a 4% improvement. You don't want to go through all that pain and trouble to get a very small emissions reduction. It would be remiss of me at this point to not actually highlight the fact that there's other things you can do to reduce emissions. Here's a graphic that we published last year in a white paper we did on how to decarbonise the freight sector, the road freight sector. It looks complicated, but it's actually relatively easy. It's basically a bang for buck presentation graphic, right? So on the left-hand side here is the bang factor. So how much emissions reduction do you get? On this side is the bucks. How expensive is that? The switch to alternative fuels and technologies, these three up the top, very, very effective if powered by renewable energy, but also quite expensive. And I just wanted, very, very brief point to say that there's a bunch of other stuff that you can do in your existing diesel fleet or even with electric trucks that is quite cost effective and provides reasonable and quite significant in some cases emissions reductions, right? Key thing here is it's not an either or. So it's really important to recognise that we're going to need both, and actually doing both improves the case, the business case, the operational case for electric trucks. And that's because anything you do around efficiency and productivity reduces your energy use for that task. And guess what? If you reduce your energy use, you can increase your range for an electric truck, and that's one of the key barriers to people taking those up. So we need it all, right? It's not one or the other. Last slide, and I'm time limited here. It's very easy to do, I won't say it's very easy, it's relatively easy to do a transition with one or two trucks, right? So you get the truck, you might get some grant funding, you put some charging in, do some training on your drivers, out you go, you select a task that it can achieve. That picture looks really different once you start transitioning half your fleet or half your depot or your full fleet. We did a study with Lauren a couple of years ago. You can download this paper from the QTLC website, looking at what some of those barriers are to transition. There's a whole bunch of them here around, contracting arrangements. Do you have the right after sales support? How long is the vehicle going to last for? And our next three speakers, Nathan's going to be talking about some of the mitigations for cost. Raina's going to be talking about some of the charging infrastructure challenges, and Mark's going to talk about availability of vehicles, right? So we're going to address some of those. But I guess for some people on the line here is what can you do today, going back to your office or to your depot, to actually help support that rollout? There are things that all of us can do as members of that environment, and probably grouped into three main areas. One is just sending a signal that this is actually that's something you prefer. As a freight buyer, this is something you want to see, right? And you can do that through contract conditions, preferred purchasing arrangements, even financial incentives, co-funding trials and things. Governments can provide concessions and exemptions. We're already seeing that in some cases, and Mark might touch on that. And I think this last one here is really important. So it's not just CO2. So zero emission trucks bring noise reductions. They're relatively quiet vehicles, so that helps in the workplace and then in the community, and a reduction in pollution, in fact, elimination of tailpipe emissions. So big health benefit there. Just sending that signal. Secondly is this is just around task flexibility, right? We often hear helping fleets that, mate, I'm not going to go for that. Can't do 1,500 kilometres and charge in half an hour, right? But guess what? 90% of trucks don't need to be able to do that, or 90% of buses or 90% of cars. You start with the easiest tasks, and you might even be able to adapt some of those more difficult tasks to accommodate the capabilities of these vehicles. You can do like night deliveries, build in some additional time for charging, and just being realistic about how much load you have to carry, right? Not every truck carries weight up to its maximum limit. The last group is really about energy, and this all revolves around energy hydrogen, battery electric, they are energy limited compared to diesel. And so any opportunity to top up to get energy actually improves the operational and the business case. So providing, you've got a truck that's delivering to a supermarket, it's going to be there for an hour or 2 hours or whatever it is. It could be topping up there, which then extends its operational capability. A lot of the work that we're doing with Lauren is around vehicles actually extending their range by topping up at freight hubs and destinations. So that's another opportunity. And I mentioned the importance of renewables. So everything revolves around the energy, and that's largely what the Future Freight Energy Hubs program is about. And it wasn't entirely my fault that it got called that. Thank you, Lauren. I'm going to pause here. I'm happy to take some questions. Ask me about any of those, or you can reach out later and get my contact details there. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. If you pop in your chat, questions in the chat function, people will grab them from there. And the first has come through from Jeff Andrews. And the question is on where telematics actually fits in the decarb piece.
Fantastic. I like this one because actually one of the big shifts that we see in fleet, sorry, I won't go on too long, is there's a cultural shift when people transition to an electric vehicle. And that could be light vehicles or heavy vehicles, buses, trucks, doesn't really matter. And one of those is I've been working for almost 2 decades now, trying to get fleets to look at their energy data, right? So, hey, how much fuel do you use? I don't know. What's the difference between vehicles? I don't know. So we help them work through that process. But one of the fascinating things is as soon as there's a shift to electric vehicles, all the energy related data is easier to get, much more comprehensive, and people become interested. So telematics plays a really critical element in that process. And we work with fleets to work through that telematics data because it basically provides them the evidence that they need to actually justify their business case. So I hope that answers the question, but yes, telematics, critical. People should be using it already on their diesel trucks, but if they're not, then absolutely on electric.
And Davinia's just clarified aftermarket, no OEM telematics. Davinia, any more pointed question you want to ask Mark at this point?
No.
Mark, I'll ask the question that no one's answering here today, but where do you see hydrogen coming in? There's lots of talk about when and if it will come for the heavy duty long haul task. Do you have an answer?
Sorry, you said we had how long? I like the theoretical benefits of hydrogen and the way it's been promoted, but it's just not realistic in the short to medium term. Maybe long term we'll see that. It's certainly been marketed very well, and look, there's probably a bit of greenwashing out there, but the theoretical benefits of hydrogen around less weight penalty, longer range, all that kind of thing, we're actually just not seeing that out there. And there's no green hydrogen out there, right? So the question that I put together around, the point around renewable energy powering battery electric trucks, it's even more important for hydrogen, and there's just not a lot of green hydrogen being made there. And what does get made probably shouldn't go to trucks, and we certainly shouldn't be burning it in the engine like some people are promoting, because that's just very wasteful. I think by the time the infrastructure is ready, the refueling, the products themselves, and the diversity of manufacturers that are doing it, I just feel like battery electric will be suitable for 95% of vehicles by the time that hydrogen is ready. And then you don't have the economy of scale, right, for hydrogen. So it's not, I don't see it as a viable technology. Cost is, of all things, cost is the biggest factor, and we've done a lot of work in that space. Happy to talk about that further, but it's not viable in the short term.
Thanks, Mark. We are going to keep rolling with presenters. Please, if you have questions as we go, for anyone, pop them in the chat function. If they're not related to the speaker that's currently speaking, just specify who they are and we'll continue on.
And can I just follow up on that? I should have said at the beginning of that was we are technology agnostic. So we do that analysis when people want that done. It's certainly not a position that we oppose hydrogen. It's just, where does it work and where does it stack up operationally and financially? So that's what that answer was based on. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. So our next speaker is the CEO of Truck Industry Council Australia, Mark Hammond, and like all good advocates, he is holed up somewhere in Canberra between meetings with politicians. So hence the dark spot. If we can spotlight Mark, we can see where he really is. Mark currently drives a crew cab, a four-wheel drive crew cab. I'm not really sure what his fantasy vehicle is, Mark. Do you want to tell us before you get going with your presentation?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
We can.
Yes, okay, great. And can you see my screen?
Only you.
Only me. Okay, that's a concern. Oh, okay.
Do you want me to roll for you, Mark?
Yeah, look, you might have to. I'm sorry. As you say, I'm actually held up in someone else's office, and I've only, struggling with the IT today. You look, my ideal car. I don't know. I'm not too sure. Sort of. I'm quite happy with my diesel crew cab ute. Maybe something that was a little more environmentally friendly, as long as it's got the range to allow me to get to Central Australia and Fraser Island and the other various places that I sort of like to get to, sort of when I can get away from the office. So I'm not too sure that ideal vehicle exists at the moment, but I'm sure that there's some car OEMs out there working on it.
Okay, can you see Mark's presentation, or are you looking at my Taupo Bay photos?
We can see it, but it's not in presentation mode.
Thanks.
Okay, so I'm Mark Hammond. I'm the Chief Technical Officer at Truck Industry Council. If we go to the next slide. So the next slide just shows our members. So pretty much sort of the household truck names out there. Last year, our members sold 99% of all new trucks to market in Australia. If we go to just one more click, this will show you the green circles were the members that have battery electric vehicles that were on sale last year. The blue circle being Hino has a diesel electric hybrid on sale. So I guess my presentation today is, and I might add that there'll be at least another four of those members that will have battery electric vehicles sort of rolling out here in Australia this year, possibly 5 or even 6. So we'll certainly have the majority of our members with battery electric product in either light, medium, or the heavy vehicle space sort of over the course of this year. So next slide. Just quickly, I'm going to talk about the sales numbers. So I'll look back over the last 3 years, but in particular, I guess sales for last year. All sales are above 3.5 tonne GVM. So we're talking about sort of little trucks right through to big trucks. I have a quick look at who was buying those trucks last year. Some of the roadblocks, both real and there's some perceived ones that are probably not really very realistic. And just very quickly, where we think as the Truck Industry Council, the market will be in terms of sales in 2030 here. So if we have a look at next slide, I've got the numbers for 2021, 22 and 23. So sort of first column's total trucks, so sales, so 41,044 in 22 and almost 48,000 new trucks last year. Next column's battery electric. So you can see not a lot of them, although a significant increase last year over the previous 2 years. I've put in the diesel electric hybrid sales just to give you an idea that even though there's only one supplier providing those vehicles, we're still selling more of those than sort of all the battery electric brands put together. And look, I think that gets down to sort of just the confidence sort of that product's a bit more flexible sort of for the truck operators out there over a purely battery electric truck. And I just will point out that these numbers don't include the LDV brand of van. We haven't been able to collect those numbers. So, and then obviously the final column's total low and zero emission truck sales. So we didn't even get to 1% last year, although, you know, a fourfold increase over 2022, and we see the market will continue to evolve sort of at pace over the next few years. So next slide, please. So if we break the segments down, so the segments that we use are light van, which is really a heavy van, so 3.5 tonne to 8 tonne vans, light truck 3.5 tonne to 8 tonne, medium truck is 8,001 kilos to 16,000 kilos, and a heavy truck, so the multi-axle trucks and the larger two-axle trucks are above 1,600 kilos. So they're the segmentations that we use here at the Truck Industry Council. So you can see the majority of those zero and low emission vehicles were sold in the light duty truck space. No vans for on sale, well, very few on sale, no recorded sales last year. We expect sort of vans to take off somewhat this year. Medium duty truck 16%, and a very small only a handful of sort of heavy duty trucks sold. So if you look at the majority of applications, so it was typically metro urban distribution and typically back to base each evening. Yeah, so we're seeing predominantly sort of the take up sort of in that light vehicle metro distribution type truck, which is probably not too, it's not that surprising really. Next slide, please. So if we look at who bought those trucks, so typically those trucks were purchased by large and medium fleets. So we're not seeing small fleets, and we're not seeing owner drivers take up sort of any of these zero emission vehicles. Probably a little bit different maybe the hybrids. Some of those diesel electric hybrids have gone into sort of into the smaller fleets, but so the battery electric vehicles sort of it's a large and medium sized fleets. 10% of purchasers indicated sort of that they bought the truck to trial to see sort of, you know, how the economics and operational feasibility of a battery electric vehicle or hybrid vehicle stacked up against their diesel truck. 80% of customers indicated that their main reason for purchasing the truck was for sort of corporate social responsibility goals or targets, either directly in their own company or sort of for the freight that's being that they're moving for sort of their end customer, and sort of, you know, they have corporate social responsibility goals and targets. I see that as a bit of a concern. But I'll come back to that a bit later. I think, you know, we need to be selling these vehicles to sort of a much broader audience and for, if you like, sort of other reasons. I guess what was interesting is that no one that we surveyed sort of who bought a battery electric truck last year bought it because they thought that sort of its whole of life cost was actually going to be equivalent or better than a diesel truck. So that's a bit of a concern in itself too, and I think something we need to sort of change the narrative that, but as you'll see in a sec, a lot of unknowns, I guess, sort of with a battery electric truck, and that those unknowns or uncertainties seem to be sort of the biggest issue why sort of the take up still remains quite low. As I said, sort of pretty much all those trucks were sold into a metro urban application, generally for freight distribution, back to base each night for charging, and typically slow charging, so sort of no fast charging, generally speaking. Sort of it was a slow charge overnight, sort of on the customers or the freight company's premises. And interestingly, less than 10 of those 367 sales last year for low and zero emission vehicles received any sort of government financial assistance. So these vehicles were either bought outright or on a lease arrangement without government financial assistance, which is also interesting. So just quickly, roadblocks. So I guess these are real. Upfront purchase price. I've also put that in my next slide, sort of as as a perceived obstacle, because I think there are ways around sort of addressing that upfront purchase price. Charging infrastructure, both the cost and availability, significant issues for customers who are operating out of a leased transport hub or at least transport premises, where they need to upgrade sort of or put in the charging infrastructure. A lot of landlords are not interested in sort of in upgrading the premises, so they are pretty much stuck and sort of need another charging solution. And I think we might hear sort of a bit more about that sort of from one of the other speakers today. But charging infrastructure is a significant sort of a problem sort of for a lot of fleets to get their head around at the moment. We still don't have any axle mass concessions. So again, you saw sort of the take up at the top end, sort of so for vehicles above 16-ton GVM, unless we're going to start offering sort of mass incentives or mass sort of concessions, sorry, sort of to offset the extra weight of these trucks, then operators are finding that their operations are suffering too much. Anything up to 25% sort of payload sort of capacity, sort of because of the weight of the battery. So that needs to be offset. Another issue for big trucks is we still haven't moved to 2.55 metres. We've changed the Australian design rules, but we haven't changed the in-service regulations, and that's probably still another 6 months away. So I guess one of the key messages here is that regulation is just taking too long to change. We need to be sort of governments need to be a lot more proactive. If they really want to sort of, see these trucks roll out, we need to sort of, offer more mass. We need to sort of get our heads around sort of revised vehicle dimensions. Another roadblock, the unknown cost of sort of the road user charge. We've seen sort of Victoria's attempts at sort of putting extra charges on battery electric vehicles in the light vehicle space. If you're a truck operator, you need to understand sort of what if there's going to be some sort of mass penalty sort of that you'll be paying in terms of a road user charge. So we need that discussion now. We need sort of we don't need to change the road user charge in the next year or two, but we need some sort of future certainty. So we take that unknown out of the equation. These vehicles have obviously got less flexibility. Sort of they're somewhat range limited. At the moment, sort of the largest trucks are sort of mass limited. So that's another sort of issue sort of for a lot of freight companies that they need to sort of factor in to their costs. Unknown resale value, so total cost of ownership, very hard to calculate if you don't know sort of what the resale value of the truck's going to be sort of at the end of your life of that vehicle. Again, though, that there's probably ways of overcoming that, and I'll talk about that in a sec. So I guess all those issues above sort of lead to uncertainty, and I think it's a lot easier sort of for most operators to stay with what they know, and that's to go and buy another diesel truck rather than to move in sort of to a hybrid or take the big step into sort of a battery electric truck, which is unfortunate. Next slide, please. And of course, some real roadblocks. I mean, we don't have the technology sort of, it's either the technology doesn't exist or it's just simply not economically viable to run sort of, line haul operations, mass constrained freight, and remote area sort of transport at this point in time. That'll change. Hydrogen might be a solution for that, but, those sectors, I think, sort of are going to be by far the last to take up these technologies. So perceived upfront purchase price. Look, I think that can be largely overcome by leasing the truck, because if you're paying a lease for the vehicle sort of upfront, but you're also paying less per week because of sort of the electricity, the energy you're using, then I think that sort of, that per week or per month lease cost is more than comparable with the diesel truck. So I think sort of the upfront purchase price can sort of, there are mechanisms around that. Supply of trucks, people say, oh, the bottleneck is sort of there aren't enough trucks. Our members could easily have supplied 3 to 4 times the number of trucks last year than we did. Frankly, it's the customers who are missing. So I say we'll have another 4 or 5 brands sort of, adding battery electric vehicles to their lineup here in Australia this year. Supply of trucks at this point in time is not a problem. If you have to supply 40,000 trucks in a year, that would be an issue, but 5,000 or 6,000 trucks sort of, yeah, I mean, that's doable over the next couple of years. We just need customers for them. The unknown price of electricity or its price relatively to diesel, I think that's another furphy. I mean, I think there's sort of enough information out there, enough predictions to show that sort of neither electricity or diesel is going to be massively different in terms of its pricing sort of and its price relativity sort of over the next few years. So, I think that, the numbers stack up today, they'll stack up moving forward. An unknown resale value. Again, I think if the vehicle's leased, then you can take that out of sort of your cost calculations. And just quickly, last slide, where we think the market will be in Australia in 2030, about 50,000 new trucks. We believe over 10,000 of those will be battery electric. Again, mainly sort of in the light and the medium vehicle space. Probably about 2,000 sort of hybrid vehicles. So we think about 25% of new truck sales by 2030 could realistically be zero emission. However, as Mark Gjerek sort of pointed out a bit earlier, if you add up all the zero emission trucks we're going to sell between now and then, it's probably only 2 to 3% of the fleet. So, we really need to be selling 100% zero emission trucks at the moment. And obviously that's not practical. So I shall leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Just having a look at the questions. Yeah. I don't, would the figures that you put up include the Arena Team Global Express bid trucks, Mark?
It did, because I mean those trucks are being sold or actually delivered sort of over a 2-3 year period. They weren't, even though the numbers sort of look fairly big, they were not delivered in a single 12-month period.
Yeah. Thanks. And there's also a question about what your thoughts are on the Janus approach, the exchangeable battery one.
Well, yeah, I mean, they've got a few other problems, but yeah, look, I think it's an interesting concept. Again, you've still got sort of a truck that is significantly heavier than a diesel prime mover, and probably still only suitable for a single trailer operation. So, it doesn't. I don't think the technology is there at the moment. You just can't put enough energy sort of into a battery for a prime mover application to be sort of, a really viable proposition, I think. But we've come a hell of a long way, 20 years ago from a lead acid battery to where we are now. It's probably going to take one more sort of iteration of battery technology. If we can double the energy density, sort of reduce the weight by 50% or something, it suddenly opens up a lot more sort of applications. And I think that's, as Mark Gjerek said, probably going to be a lot more likely than sort of, hydrogen sort of being sort of the answer to sort of some of those, larger freight applications. But at the moment, I just don't see that prime movers sort of, we're better off sort of targeting sort of vehicles sort of in that urban distribution network, be they light, medium or heavy, where where we know that the technology works, and we know that from an economic point of view, sort of it's reasonably viable in terms of sort of whole of life cost over, or first whole of life cost over a 5 to 7 year period for that truck.
Thanks, Mark. There's a couple additional questions, but we are on a time schedule and we need to keep going with presenters. If you're here at the end, we'll put those to you so you don't escape them. But thank you for making yourself available. Our next presenter is Nathan Gore-Brown, previously of Movement, but now at Revora. So we're excited to hear what he's got to offer, particularly in the refridge sector. I asked Nathan what he currently drove, and of course it's a Tesla 2019 Model 3. And what his fantasy car was, which I had to look up. It's a Porsche Taycan. What colour, Nathan?
Oh, look, there's too many colours to choose from, Lauren. but I'm a sucker for blue cars, so it'd probably be blue.
Keen to hear what you got to say today, Nathan. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks very much for having me. And look, I'm looking to build upon the guys talking about the different barriers that we see in electric truck space, and specifically hone down on some of those cost barriers that Mark Hammond was just talking about as well, and consider how rental or leasing and so on might be able to support folks over that particular barrier. But a little bit of background to start with. And it's getting towards the back end of the day, so I'm sure you're all, ready for dinner and so on. And I just wanted to give you a bit of an insight of where we're coming from. Yes, I'm ex-movement, but for the last 12 months, I've been working on the refrigerated transport space, and specifically, that is an area that touches our lives every day. We've got fresh food coming to our places, coming to our shopping centres and so on. And so everybody's affected by this particular market. And like Mark Gjerek was saying before, the transport sector is going to grow. So 20% over the course of the rest of the decade if we do nothing in emissions, similarly in activity. And the same thing goes here for our refrigerated space. As we've got population growth, we'll need more food. More food means more transport of fresh food. And so that's the area that we specifically focus in. Eurocold is the parent company of Revora, and Revora is the organisation that I run, which is the futures business for Eurocold. And as a business, we are investing in today and tomorrow with our decades of logistics, cold chain logistics experience, and specifically in the rental space. So a lot of what I'm drawing from here is our real world experience around renting trucks to those food freight fleets. Say that 5 times fast. We're national based. We've got at the moment over 360 diesel refrigerated trucks that we have on rent with customers all over Australia. And our first zero emission trucks are just hitting the road now, which is what my focus has been for the last 12 months. And so what we saw there from various previous speakers was just some of the barriers that we're noticing as fleets as we're looking to transition. And I'm just going to, touch on a few of those. And I think back to what Mark Gjerek was saying earlier, is making the strategic commitment to make a change is probably the first and foremost thing a fleet needs to do if it's considering transitioning away from a business as usual environment. We really need to, if I want to lose weight, I've got to stop eating the pies and get down the gym. And the same thing goes here. If we really want to decarbonise our fleet, we've got to make the decision to get the equipment to do so, and we've got to make the decision to get the energy that will support that as well. And beyond that, and some of the work that I've been doing a lot in this last 12 months is really understanding the trucks that are available on the market and finding out what are those that are appropriate for the job. And Mark Hammond mentioned that about, payload issues. And in some cases, I noticed that, wheelbases, the trucks have to be longer to fit in the bigger batteries. And so that truck might be too long for the truck the truck we're trying to build for a customer. And so you end up with this dichotomy of all sorts of different aspects of truck physicals that then make it difficult for the customer to, or for the end user fleet to find the right truck for them. So that's a thing that all fleets are going to have to work through. And at the same time, whilst dealing with finding the right product, they're going to have to be a little bit flexible with the work that they do. So whether that's rearranging a route to be able to support the truck's capabilities, or maybe changing times of day that support better outcomes. But I've spoken to lots of refrigerated fleet companies which start really, really early in the day, and they're really excited about the concept of doing deliveries at 1 and 2 in the morning because they dodge traffic, and they can maybe even get 2 runs in a day. So that's a potential enabling area of electric vehicles. But these are the things that fleets need to be thinking about. And charging, which I know Raina's going to take us on a great journey on, but really getting the right sized, right shaped solution for your environment is going to be very specific to you and your user case. So that they're really important barriers that all fleets are going to have to work through and overcome. We asked the question before about telematics, and it's an area I've been doing a lot of work on, but you can't manage what you don't measure. And particularly in the early days of an electrification journey, you kind of need confidence, right? You need to know what's going on with your vehicles. And so getting good data management is a barrier that you're going to have to address, and make sure that you've got great data management so that you can feel confident that your trucks are going to work well every day, every time. And then as you're going on, you'll be using that data, maybe less about confidence, but more about optimization. How can we get more out of the trucks that we've procured? But finally, and the one that I'm going to do a little bit of a deep dive into, is about that change to the capital and operational cost mix that a fleet would have today, and dealing with the transformation. Change is always a challenge, and the change of physicals and the operationals with regards to electric vehicles are enough to deal with in themselves. Getting people to change as well is also a challenge. But then we add in their financial model changing, and that's in some cases too much for people to deal with. And so there are a few things to be thinking about there. So I'm just going to deep dive into that particular facet at this point. So the capital tables will turn with a transition to a zero emission, particularly electric truck, whilst the actual total cost of ownership will change from small vehicles through large vehicles through specific user cases. And there's some great work in previous QTLC papers that talk about that. Ultimately, the mix of how much capital you've got, in this case, the dark green bars, and how much operational cost, the day-to-day running, weekly running costs in the light green bars, will flip. And this is a bit of a generic piece I've got at the moment, but it's about 1/3 capital and 2/3 operational cost in most fleets environments right now for a diesel truck. And on an electric space, they cost more. They're like double, sometimes triple the cost of the equivalent vehicle. And then electricity is cheaper per K or per activity typically. And so maintenance and so on all make for the operational cost of an electric vehicle to be less. And so there's this flip. So then the next thing is, as a fleet, you then are operating on a daily basis. And right now you're spending a lot of money on a daily basis because you're fueling and maintenance and so on. But it didn't cost you relatively as much to finance and in that capital space. But in the future, that'll be more. And so that'll have an impact on businesses' balance sheets and their access to capital, and how they're going to be able to use that capital for their business. And so what that means is, as Mark Hammond was talking about, maybe there's a different way to be considering our approach to getting hold of a vehicle of this nature, instead of just, forking out the readies and going to buy one. So when you do buy one, that capital commitment can be a real challenge. And what it does in some cases with businesses is impact their ability to deploy capital elsewhere. Most of the kind of industry that I focus on at the moment have massive cold stores. Those cold stores aren't cheap. And so they've got finite limited resources for capital. And where do they put it? They put it more into the fleet, or do they put it into their cold stores and their refrigerated depots? And so that becomes another conversation to be had. And so that brings you to leasing. And leasing is an option. But typically what it does is it ties you into a fairly long period of time, which is great. It reduces the risk to both parties, both the leasing company and also the end user customer, the customer that's paying for that. But what you're doing is I'm signing up to this electric vehicle on day to day for the next 7 years or 5 years or whatever period of time you've chosen. And that can be that can be a bit of too long a commitment for some players. So what we're starting to see also is that rental might also be an option. Like leasing, you can add things like insurance, you'll add things like a service package and other elements to the overall package of the vehicle. But with a rental offer, it's typically for a shorter period. You're more able to hand the vehicle back if you so choose through the process. And in these early days of electrification, whilst folks are, to be honest, still working out what they need to know and learn, then a rental model might be something that supports them. So rentals are typically a shorter period, There's typically short-term rental, like you go down to Kennards and hire a whippersnipper for the weekend to clear the block. That might be something you could do, but that's not particularly what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about a longer-term rental. So usually a couple of years or year or two, and then what it is it's enough of a commitment from the rental company, but it's also enough of a commitment for enough flexibility for the end user to start their journey. So that long-term hire might be a solution that supports people. There's a number of different providers out there for this sort of stuff. That's something we're providing in Eurocold's refrigerated space, but there are other players offering this kind of stuff out there for other types of vehicles, for all sorts of other types of trucks that are in the marketplace. And so what it will do is allow fleets to engage for a reasonable term that they're comfortable with early on before they might go and have something a little bit longer term or a longer term arrangement with a rental company. It reduces that capital burden. And they can deploy that elsewhere in the business. Now, whether you're a high capital business like those refrigerated storage sheds that I'm talking about, or you're doing something else, ultimately, we all have a finite amount of capital that we can deploy. So this is an opportunity to remove that from your balance sheet and push it to a rental company. And then when organisations are looking at these vehicles, and I'll touch on this a little bit, is what you really need to do is make sure you're getting the best zero emission vehicle that is available. Not all vehicles, apologise if there's some background noise, not all vehicles in the marketplace today, not all trucks in the marketplace, whether that be in the 4.5 tonne space or right up through into the larger, medium and larger rigid space, are they going to be suitable for your needs? There's payload, there's wheelbase and chassis considerations and others. You need to really be across that. And so a rental company might have done that work like I have with our world. You need to protect yourself from those costs, those vehicle-related cost depreciation. And so a lease and a rental would be able to offer those kinds of protections for you. And it helps you to, it could help you to have flexibility as your business grows. So if for whatever reason your business does shrink or you're seasonal, you might be able to work with that. And then beyond that, as your business grows, you can add on more of the same kind of model that you've become comfortable with. And then one of the things that's important, and I know Raina's there, delighted to be speaking next on this sort of thing, but it's really important that when you're considering any transition to any electric vehicle, that you've got a charging solution understood as part of the package of the work that you're looking to deliver with the task you're looking to do with the truck, and also the vehicle itself, and you're building your site. All those three things need to come into play to what is the right charging solution for you. And some hire organisations will provide you with that support as well as we do. We would hire you the right charging solution or help find one that suits you. So all of those sorts of things come together to give you a solution that could be more balanced, have less risk, and more flexibility, which in these early days when you're still trying to learn and build confidence might be just the thing to remove those barriers that otherwise are sensing. So I think that's me done. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to come back to you guys. And
Nathan, there's a really good question in the chat from Jeff Andrews, if you can see it.
I'm just switching to problems. I'm just switching across.
Do you expect EVs to last longer than ICE vehicles? And if so, how does that affect depreciation costs and the changeover and things like total cost of ownership?
Really great question. I expect modern electric trucks to last overall about the same length of time that we expect diesel trucks do today. When you've got a diesel truck at 10 years old, it's already starting to get a little bit rattly. When it's getting to 20 years old, it's out on the farm. Typically, there's been some good studies done in the past around that. So if we talk about that, let's call it that 10-year space, typically batteries are what people think about. So is the motor going to wear out? No. Are the electronics going to wear out? No, probably not. Is the battery going to start to deplete? Somewhat, but how much? Not as much as people think it will be, is my general answer to that. there are several vehicles in the marketplace that have set the tone for what battery life is in an electric vehicle, and they would be things like early Priuses and early Nissan Leafs, and you can almost set your watch by 8 years and they're dead. But there are several Tesla and other well-managed battery systems in cars and trucks that are out there that have been shown to be doing, 1 million kilometers, 500,000 kilometers, no questions asked, still going. There are Teslas here in Australia that have achieved greater than 700,000 kilometers and have only lost 12% of their battery capability. So that's very dependent on the manufacturer, the cell, and also specifically the cooling system, the battery management system. And when you kind of pull all that together, there's a very good chance that battery electric vehicles will last as long as ICE vehicles do for their typical life cycle. I think the only thing I would then caveat is today's electric vehicles will probably have a certain life cycle that will be X, and tomorrow's electric vehicles will probably be even better than the ones we get today.
Thanks, Nathan, and appreciate you doing that in the corner of that conference. We, if it's possible, if you can stay with us for a little while, we've got another question there I'd like you to answer, if possible, later.
Sure.
In the meantime, we'll get on with the next speaker. Raina is from NewVolt Infrastructure. They've got a pretty snazzy new website. It looks very cool, and you'd be fooled by thinking they are newcomers to the block, but they've been kicking around for a while, talking to fleets and precincts and hubs, the same people as us, in understanding what solution works best for charging. It's a fascinating journey, and it's about to get even more exciting, I think. And in keeping with the theme of fantasy cars, Raina's also got a car that I had to look up. It is a charge car Mustang. They're converting Mustangs to EVs, he explained, and they're making about 500 of them for a cool $500,000 each. So I hope NewVolt goes very well, Raina, and we're keen to hear how well.
Yeah, well, if we can do it so well that I can afford a $500,000 car, then we're all winning, right? So, can I confirm, just to stop me if you're not seeing my screen? So I'll kick off. Thank you. So look, a little bit of a background on NewVolt. Look, I don't want to talk too much about NewVolt today and talk more about charging, but as Lauren mentioned, we have been around for a little while now, back to 2019. We were founded with a purpose to provide freight efficiency and supply chain security for Australia in a net zero world. So what that really means is when we're thinking about the freight sector in Australia, and acknowledging that we're heading towards that net zero world, what is the most cost-effective way that we can do that? And what are the solutions for Australian industry, to Mark's point before, that can leverage the best parts about Australia? So our vision for the future of Australia is one that is, yes, we've got to go through a difficult period here, but this can be a very positive thing for Australia. How are we going about that? So very quickly, our vision, and it has been mentioned a few times before, is a national network of shared charging infrastructure. So we acknowledge the role that infrastructure, and particularly charging infrastructure, plays in this transition, and how difficult some of these things are. And so our goal here is to provide a network for shared infrastructure for the fleet operators of Australia. So this is a little bit different to bucket-based charging, but we'll get into a little bit of that in a couple of slides time. So something I just want to touch on, and Mark mentioned this before, about renewable energy. So this slide here is a solar irradiation display, sort of describing, and this is probably a little bit old now, but at a period of time, effectively the generation capacity of solar across the world. So if you see there in the center of the screen, you see Australia, and I think, as we know, this is a very unique opportunity for Australia. So there is a cliche that I think we say, that a lot of us here at NewVolt have said, but others have heard, that we can really be our own Saudi Arabia here. And if we think of fuel as an electron, and we think of Australia's ability to generate cheap electrons, we have a massive opportunity here. And if you look at the maps of some of these other markets around the world, particularly Europe, who are a little bit further ahead, and particularly the States, Australia does have a unique opportunity here, particularly in an industry that, if you look at the sort of the entire supply chain industry through to the end buyer, we are at the burden of imported diesel and the fluctuations around that cost. So we see this here at NewVolt as a huge opportunity for Australia and our ability to effectively get the lowest cost electron into a truck. So to talk a little bit more about infrastructure, so I think as the guys have mentioned today, there is probably a balance between where we see that charging infrastructure emerging. So one, we've discussed a little bit about back at base. So these would be solutions that you're putting back in at your facilities. I know Nathan has a couple of solutions that he provides or recommends hire things. You could work with providers such as your EPC partners out there to build infrastructure. This is where you are wearing all of that CapEx cost. And depending on your duty cycle, the type of truck you're charging, the capacity and the rate at which you need to charge, those costs can vary. So there are solutions today that will allow you, a slower charge overnight, be it a simple DC charge, something that you can plug into the wall, ranging all the way up to a fully fledged charging solution. Now, on the other side, there is going to have to be a shared use or a form of shared use infrastructure emerge. And we see that emerging either as a predominantly cost borne by either private and probably to a lesser extent public, but mostly private investment. So the combination of these two is what is going to be required in Australia as we move forward, because it certainly isn't going to be possible for everyone to be building out charging infrastructure back at their base. So to talk a little bit about charging, I want to focus on fast charging because I think for the transport industry, fast charging is very, very critical. Now, there are some duty cycles where it does make sense, where you can slow charge overnight. I won't focus on that for the moment. I'm just going to talk about fast charging. So on the left-hand side, you've got currently where fast charging is at today. So if you've got chargers that will provide up from about 50 to 250 kilowatts. So you're looking at a charge time of up to probably 2 hours for a mid-size EV up to a heavy. And then in the middle, we've got what we're calling, I'll call it a mid-range fast charger. And there are two examples there. I think I saw Dylan from ChemPower on the call, so he'd be very happy to see his power unit offering right in the middle there. So here you're looking up to around 450 kilowatts. So we are seeing these arriving probably in the next 12 months. In fact, NewVolt has a site which has charging capabilities up to 450, which is hopefully arriving within the next 12 to 18 months. And then the thing that is on the horizon, which is very important for fleets to understand, is the emergence of what we call MCS or megawatt charging. So here you're talking up to 3.5 megawatts. So your charging time is now coming down into the minutes. Now, there are large claims here of charging a truck within 10 minutes, let's say from a base rate of around 20 to 30% up. Now, we need to imagine that alongside that, you need a truck that has the capability to access MCS. So there are a bunch of trials that are occurring now. I know Scania has a trial currently live in Europe with MCS. I think it's ABB, and there are other trials emerging, and all the major charging manufacturers have some form of MCS trials coming within the next year. Now, the mass rollout of that, if you look at Europe, I think it's Milence, who is probably the leading charging hub company over there. They are rolling out exclusively megawatt charging across 1,700 sites across Europe. So they're going straight to there. So we see that as the dominant technology. Now, of course, that comes with a bit of a penalty in terms of cost of infrastructure and grid connection. So it could be a bit challenging to be rolling out MCS at your own sites and depots, depending on your grid connection. But we'll talk about that in a second. So as operators, you will have choices. Back at base charging solutions are going to support many applications, and there are solutions today, as I think Nathan offers as part of his solution as well, as an example, that will support you getting into a truck today and having a bit of a play and having a go. And it's very, very important. And at scale, that may work as well. But there are some considerations depending on what sort of duty cycles you are running. And as you start to scale these, you start to hit these complexities, and I've listed a few on the right-hand side. So you may have site constraints. So grid capacity is probably the first and foremost where you're going to run into challenges. So what is the size of the capacity? What is the size of the pipe of energy that is going into your site? What is the cost to upgrade that, and what is the time to upgrade? These are critical factors you need to think about when you're planning and going from, let's say, a trial up to a bit of scale. Then second, alongside of that, what is the investment in this technology? Are you, and I think Mark Hammond mentioned a few of these, what sort of lease are you on? Are you on a 5-year lease? Are you on a 10-year lease? Do you own your site? How do you amortize those costs over 5 years? For instance, if you know if that lease period looks like that. So there are challenges there when you think about that and when you're looking to scale. Operational complexity. Now, as I think somebody before mentioned the Team Global Express trial that Heatherbone, I think JetCharge and the Volvo guys and a few of the other OEMs were looking at. So if you look at some of their learnings, that interestingly, you know, obviously they're still getting to the operations on the trucks, but some of their challenges, their biggest challenge was actually around design and layout. It was around cabling. Where do they run cables? Are the cables on the right side of the trucks? How do they run them around, you know, looping over other areas and everything like this? So they had a lot of challenges there in layout, and some of their learnings are a very curious read. So important things to consider. And then from a performance perspective, what are your availability, reliability, and also flexibility guarantees if you need to change and adapt between slow and fast? All important things to consider when you're considering back at base versus leveraging a third-party solution. So we do believe that shared use is going to have to play a critical role. So if you look at the slide in the middle, you can see a couple of breakdowns of how that segment may emerge. Now we see shared use playing a role probably in your key industrial areas like intermodals, ports, and hub and spoke precincts, and then on your en route sites and sort of corridor areas. Now I think, as Mark mentioned, those en route highway sites are probably a little bit further away based on the payload penalties and the trucks and the technology that are arriving. But absolutely today, there are duty cycles that are emerging around ports and intermodals and hub and spoke that make logical sense, particularly in the shared use space. So this gives operators access to fast charging without having to build them back at their own facilities. It gives you guaranteed availability through scheduled charging. It allows you to look at contracts rather than a CapEx spend at your own sites. So it's more efficient utilization of that infrastructure, and allows you to access price locked energy, which I think is a really critical component. So the shared use hub operator essentially is selling you that energy, but can have long-term contracts to lock that energy price, which is quite critical currently in a volatile energy market. And we are seeing the shared use market, the shared use model emerge in other markets. And I think this is, if you haven't looked at any of these examples, I strongly encourage you to go and have a look at them. So on the left-hand side, two examples emerging in California and the west coast of the US. Forum Mobility will focus specifically on drayage or wharf cartage. They have one site live, and the second one there, I believe they're building or launching within the next 3 or 4 months. Terawatt, I believe, have 4 sites under construction. And on the right-hand side, you have the European examples, Mylance, I mentioned before, who are a cooperative effort between the Tratton Group, Volvo, and Daimler. They are building 1,700 sites across Europe, and they have 2 live, and I think they're going to have 6 live within the next 2 years or year. So a hugely massive scale of a project. And then Einride, who are actually pivoted now into sort of different applications, but they have a few sites live in Europe. But all of these models, and there are many other examples, are based in that shared use space to offset what is difficult in these markets to access. You know, when you have mandates coming in, it's very difficult to access potentially the grid connection, the capacity that you need, and that CapEx to deploy on your own site. So we are seeing that shared use model emerge in other markets, and we absolutely think it's going to emerge here in Australia as well. So what does that mean for Australia? Well, the difference between those markets and us is that, you know, our road freight network is a little bit more simple. We've favorably chosen to live in a couple of cities or major cities down the eastern seaboard, and our freight task is far more highly concentrated in those markets. So whilst that is simple, our challenge becomes now is where to deliver the energy required at the lowest cost. So the benefit of that is when we are actually looking at planning, and I'm going to use the word precinct, Lauren and Mark, because you have used the word precinct, so we've co-opted this. But I think for us, where is this shared use infrastructure going to start emerging? And here at NewVolt, we like to think about this as activation precincts. And we think of it as a combination of many factors. So firstly, you know, an access to infrastructure. So this is grid and energy capacity alongside an appropriate road network. On the right-hand side, you have a supportive environment, including regulation. To Mark Hammond's point, is where do exemptions exist? So we are seeing them emerge, you know, on some of the roads here in Victoria and Melbourne. We're seeing front axle weight limits and the steering axle weight limits emerge in South Australia and New South Wales as well, but also policy and ESG commitments and other drivers as well. These could be ESG factors or mandates coming from an end buyer of transport services. We see Woolies commitments of where they need to get to. So there's a profitable environment there. On the left-hand side, you have your logical density. So this is established industry clustering with high volume potential for call it energy or fuel demand. So where are trucks running today? Ideally, they're going to be running tomorrow. And then your final factor, I think, is the technology and the economics, which the previous presenters have actually spoken about. So where are those TCO, truck charging capability and duty cycle combinations? Where is the sweet spot of that emerging today? And we are seeing those emerge in other markets. So an example of one we might want to talk about, for instance, is container movements. Now, of course, I will ignore some of the payload limits here for the moment, just as an example. So GHD, and I think I saw both Tristan and Nick on the call, have produced this fantastic origin destination report on the Port of Brisbane. So here instantly you can see on the left-hand side where those trucks are running out of the Port of Brisbane. So the red indicates the amount of trucks or number of routes running along that road, which is heading out the Logan, up the Warrego. On the right-hand side, you're seeing where the TEUs of imported trucks are running. So straight away, you see a logical clustering for a particular duty cycle. So as an example, in the bottom left-hand corner, you can start to plan out, well, there is clearly an activity precinct in Acacia Ridge, right? There's an activity precinct directly on the Port of Brisbane on the island itself, where they have less restrictions around their weight limits because they're controlling their own roads. So logically there, we can start having a look at, well, what's an activation precinct look like? Who are the customers there? What duty cycles are they running? Where this makes logical sense. What is the access to the grid? What is the access to the trucks? And alongside of that, there is, of course, how are we going to purchase these trucks? And that's why I have to credit everything that Nathan has said previously, because I also personally believe, and it's our view at NewVolt as well, is that leasing or renting is the logical way for this market to emerge to begin. As an example, NewVolt is doing something here down in Melbourne. So we have naturally a courtesy of the government, we have a potential offering on the cards for a BEV cost offset versus the diesel equivalent for up to 20 to heavy or medium BEV trucks. We're going to have fast charging this facility, so probably up to 8 400 kilowatt charging bays and around 22. I mean, 175. They're not that slow, but they're slow in the context of large trucks, and a strategically located facility with secure gated operations. And we're hoping to get that functional in Q2 2025. But this site was brought together with all of those factors in mind. So a favorable regulatory environment with exemptions around the front axle weight limit, access to grid and infrastructure, trucks that can actually do the job and appropriate duty cycles that can work, and a high density of trucks being that inner west region of Melbourne, which a similar GHD study shows, I think 34% of all traffic running in and out of the port runs to that area. So one thing that I think it's important to finish on, and it probably encapsulates a lot of what the other speakers are saying, but how do you stay informed and get involved in this? And I think it's the slide that I like to speak to. So on the left-hand side, subscribe to everything Movement puts out. I think the Movement guys are doing a fantastic job. The next one next to it, which is worth looking at, are the Run on Less NACFI guys out of the US. I think they're doing some fantastic webinars and some fantastic information. I'll show you something in a minute, but check that out. The NACFI Run on Less team over there, excellent reports, a lot of stuff we can learn out of the US. Staying up to date on the trends. So keep following Laura and the great work that she's doing at QTLC. I think the HVIA is doing some fantastic work. And if you're not already getting down for the Truck Show X in Cape Schanck later in May, I'd highly recommend it for anyone who's interested in carbon neutral or zero emissions transport. And look for these trial projects. I think show intention, as I think it was both Mark and Nathan have said. I think it's really, really important that you're out there showing intention towards these things. ARENA will come back with funding in the space, absolutely guaranteed. The government does believe that this is an important thing, and engage with the projects that Lauren and Mark have from the future freight energy hubs as well. Just a quick soundbite out for Run on Less. So I think if you haven't already gone and have a look, go and check out this data. It is fantastic information on what trucks are doing. All the Tesla data, so those Pepsi Teslas that are running around, I think they have 16, all the data on those trucks have been published, including the kilometers they're running per day, how they're charging, what rate are they charging at, what are their downtimes are. There are e-Cascadiers there, there are medium BEVs in there as well. It's a really fantastic site. Go and check it all out. And I'm looking forward with you, Mark, to one day getting something like this up and running in Australia. So that's about it from me. I'm looking forward to hearing some questions. NewVolt, as I said, is actually trying to build a national network here in Australia. So we recognise that everyone on this call is part of that rollout. So we really want to hear from you as we plan, develop, and prioritise our network. So I'm happy to take some questions.
Thanks, Raina. That was fantastic, and it is exciting. Any questions from the floor? I see Bill Gillespie turned on his phone and video. Bill, have you got a question? Okay, if we can ask people to put their questions in the chat, that'd be appreciated. We are running towards the end of the webinar now, and we will finish early and give you back some time if you've got no questions. Before we start that, I've got a couple of questions for the audience. As Raina said, this is, you are the audience, you're the early adopters, you're the interested ones, you're the ones we want to talk to. We have a great platform here. Future Freight Energy Hubs will be the small one here in Queensland that we're rolling out to nationwide through this program. We're running newsletters, webinars, we're doing the freight precincts work. We want to know from you guys what you need to see, what you need to hear, what your fleets are concerned about so that we can get ahead of them and address them and understand them. So if you've got questions or things that you'd like to see us address through articles or through, for instance, the next webinar, please pop them in there. We're quite keen to hear and address them. This program is as good as we all make it together. So please go in there. Some more questions coming in. I've muted you all. No, I haven't muted you all.
There was one that popped up there before that maybe Raina could touch on, which was faster charging equals battery degradation / losses in heat and so on.
Yeah, I actually just answered that one in text, but absolutely, I think it is a consideration. Only fast, just like if you only fast charge your phone, which is a similar battery in many aspects, lithium-based battery, it will degrade the battery faster. Now, there's a lot of measures coming out. If you think about the passenger vehicle market, it's quite interesting. If you've got some of Tesla's numbers now, after 250, 300,000 Ks, you're seeing a battery degradation down to 70%, which is actually very, very good. But Tesla does a very, very good job of the battery talking to the charger. So if you're in a Tesla and you're driving to a charger and you know when you're going to go there, the battery starts to align itself before it gets there to take the charge. So there's a component there where the battery gets prepped before it goes to the fast charge. If you just fast charge it fresh, you're going to get a higher level of degradation. But overall, if you're only fast charging a truck, it is important that there is a slow charge in there once every couple of weeks, and overnight or something like that, just to realign and reset that battery without me going into the exact engineering of that. But yes, ultimately it will, but a slow charge every now and then will help you.
Thanks. Hopefully you're unmuted now. We're just working on that. Sorry to you all. Jackson's got a question to the panel. A lot of large companies are factoring the shadow carbon price in their business decisions. Can anyone, any of you guys or anyone on the call, want to share any examples of what different tiers of carbon pricing has done to reduce the OPEX and total cost of ownership?
Definitely seen and heard a little bit about internal carbon pricing for the very largest of companies. Whether that's in readiness for a future carbon price that they're actually going to have to pay, or as an internal, an internal measure for themselves to make sure these kinds of projects get up and don't get squashed purely on price. The values that I've seen have varied between, a little bit and a decent number, so up to something like $100, but, that's still fairly low compared to the sort of numbers that some of the papers have said, some of the research papers have said. But ultimately, it's all about those companies deciding that they are going to do this, and it's another measure within the piece that Mark Gjerek talked about, where setting the scene, whether that's internal with their own teams and procurement teams and so on, or also externally with the market at large, and that's helped reduce it. And I think one other thing I would say is talking to a customer when they said to me, we spend more than that on Manu for an evening to cook some of our products compared to the delta on a particular truck. For me, that was like, oh, okay. It is one of those things where if the business decides it wants to spend that kind of delta and go for an electric vehicle, they'll find a way. And so if you're one of those sort of companies, you'll find that way if you truly want to do it. And finally, the other thing I add is not just the carbon price, but I actually ask companies, what price do you put on training? What price do you put on teaching your team today stuff that they're going to need to know in 3 and 5 years time as you transition your fleet? The earlier you start training and putting vehicles into your fleet today, the earlier you're going to be proficient at it. And so what's the cost of training? And I try and get them to bring that into their consideration process as well. So if you're a fleet out there that's thinking about those sorts of things, similarly consider that element, the training element that you could be budgeting for too.
And if I can just jump in and add to that, and maybe Jackson answer your question very directly on the quantity, which is, I guess, what you're asking. You know, the sort of levels that you see carbon pricing in the emissions reduction fund down at $12, $13, $15. That's not going to make a difference whatsoever. At 20 to 25 bucks a ton, it's probably the equivalent of something like a 3 cent per litre increase in diesel price. Again, it helps, but it's not going to tip the business case, right? No one's going to build their case on that until you get up to, you know, European levels, $100 a ton or higher. And we've seen some of that modelling from others, but $200 a ton in 2040, that might actually make a difference, but it's a fair way off that. So it helps, but it's not critical.
We have tried to unmute everyone. Hopefully if you're on mute now, it's just because you haven't unpressed your button. We'll take final questions in the last couple of minutes. Thank you to all the tech experts out there who have answered the questions for us. So that's greatly appreciated. But anyone else who wants to ask a question, now is your chance. Okay, we are going. Yeah, we're going to ask all the presenters if they're comfortable sharing their presentation. So if that's okay, we'll send those to you in a link after this, potentially with a survey that I can get your thoughts on interesting articles for a newsletter, the next webinar, how we ask and answer the difficult questions. So thank you to all of our fantastic presenters, Mark, Raina, and Nathan. We really appreciate you coming along today and the audience participation. We're keen to get this show running when we hope to see you at some of the events and exciting things coming ahead. So we have an open line to improve this, and if you'd like to talk more, please contact me. But on behalf of everyone today, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you.